Welcome to Nous, the podcast where we tackle the deepest questions about the mind. My guest in this episode is a cognitive and developmental psychologist whose recent book, The Blind Storyteller, explores the hidden forces that distort our view of ourselves. The argument goes like this. Our outlook on the world is governed by two intuitions, deeply embedded in our core cognition, dualism and essentialism. Now, we're not talking about the philosophical doctrines of dualism and essentialism. We're talking about something a bit more like cognitive biases, powerful tendencies to make certain assumptions about the world. Dualism is the idea that agents possess an immaterial mind, separate from their body. And essentialism is the idea that living things have their nature due to some material essence. So a cat is a cat in virtue of its physical form, its body. Now, when these intuitions combine, they blind us to the reality of our own natures. For a start, they lead us to assume that ideas and knowledge can't be innate. But developmental psychology demonstrates that infants have lots of knowledge of the world that they can't have learned. And if you just balked slightly at the notion of innate ideas, well, that is one of the intuitions my guest is seeking to challenge. Professor Iris Berent, welcome to Nous.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you.
So, as I said, I've been getting to grips with your book, and the first question is a simple one: who is the blind storyteller?
So, the blind storyteller is us, the intuitive me. So, one way to think about it is, if you think about cognition, you think about there are all these instruments there, right? And there are instruments of reasoning. These are the faculties that we use when we think about ourselves analytically, scientifically. But then presumably there is this intuitive me that is driven by systems of knowledge that are likely innate and universal. And this is the storyteller that I refer to here.
Why is the storyteller blind?
I think all storytellers are blind. My cat is blind. He is the storyteller of his feline stories, and he is blind in as much as he is constrained by his own cognition. I think this is something that is easy for us to recognize when you think about an animal, right? So the book, in fact, starts with this notion of Remy, the Harvard humanity cat. So there is, in fact, in Harvard, this cat, this orange cat that is called Remy, who just goes around there. And, he goes to the library and he goes to law school and he goes to the divinity, the Harvard Divinity School. And of course, this is funny because he is entirely unaware of his surrounding and he is blind. And this is something that we can readily recognize. By the same token, I see no reason to presume that we are not free of some constraints that shape our cognition, just as Remy's cognition is constrained by certain limitations that come from who he is. So every creature is likely to have such limitations, and I'm just interested in ours.
So the blindness, our own blindness, is a kind of inability to see aspects of our own nature.
Yeah.
Now, I wondered if it would be helpful to start by trying to get the listeners to kind of engage in a thought experiment based on one of your own experiments. So listeners, imagine that there are a group of individuals raised in isolation on a desert island. They are cared for, so they're fed and watered, but there's no influence of culture. No one talks to them, no one plays with them or teaches them anything. So now I'm going to list a bunch of traits or behaviors, and you, listener, have to decide whether you think they're innate or not. And the criterion you're using is that if they are innate, you would expect these traits or behaviors to emerge spontaneously in this group of individuals, this group that's been cut off from all influence. So here's the first one. Do you think this group of individuals would display anger in response to hostility? Would they display a fear of danger? Would they walk to move around? Would they have classifications of different body parts? Would they be able to reflect on their past and on their future? Would they be able to recognize taboos? Would they be able to keep track of time? And would they form sentences? So that was a list of, That was 8 traits, 8 behaviors. What did you find, Iris, when you presented those to participants and you presented that thought experiment? What did you find people's intuitions were and why?
So people's intuitions were that those epistemic traits, things that refer to knowledge, are significantly less likely to be considered innate than the non-epistemic traits, including emotions, sensations, actions. So people thought that epistemic traits are less likely to emerge spontaneously, therefore less likely to be innate. In other experiments, we actually also ask people, point blank, are those capacities innate or not? And people here said that epistemic traits are, straightly, are not innate, whereas the emotions, sensations, and actions for them, people said, yes, these are innate.
So the list I went through ranged from emotional or sensory things, so or movement. So anger in response to hostility, that's an emotional thing, and most people seem to have an intuition that is
right.
that is innate, that
right.
would emerge spontaneously.
Right.
Walking to move around, again, people had that sort of intuition that is innate and that's something that would emerge. Whereas by the time you get towards the end of the list, reflecting on one's past and future, keeping track of time, recognizing taboos, and forming sentences, they seem like more cognitive phenomena that I guess people tend to assume that those things require the influence of cultural learning somehow, that they can't emerge innately.
Precisely. And the thing about those cognitive capacities, as I see it, if you think about cognition as, a container and something that's in the container, right? The memory and what's in the memory, or the capacity for reasoning as a sausage processor and the sausages that come with it. It's the sausages that people think cannot be innate, right? It's the propositional knowledge, it's specific ideas that sentences will have innately be constrained to have a certain structure. So it's not even the capacity to, form sentences, but it's the fact that sentences, the knowledge that constrains sentence structure will be innate. Or to give other examples, it's the notion of an object. And an object this is particular knowledge, it's a particular proposition, it's a statement that you can qualify as right or wrong, and it's those that people reject as being innate. And in fact, in other experiments, we ask people to evaluate what is it infants know, and ask them specific propositions like, do they have an abstract notion of number? Do they know that helping others is good? And people, completely rejected that as something that newborns could possibly exhibit.
And the fascinating thing, and the kicker, of course, is that there is good evidence from your point of view that all of those traits that I listed are indeed innate in some sense.
Yeah, especially the literature on infant cognition makes it very clear that there are certain core knowledge capacities that newborns indeed exhibit.
Great. Okay, so there you have it. That's a kind of key part of your argument, isn't it? That we systematically have mistaken intuitions about these things. We have this whole body of evidence, and yet we have these intuitions that are way off. Why? What role does that play in your argument?
Well, the mistake is the fingerprints of the murderer, right? And we need to, find out who are the suspects here. So the mistakes, the intuitions that knowledge cannot be innate, in the face of scientific evidence that suggests that knowledge likely is innate, at least some aspects of knowledge could be innate, raise the question, right? Why do we think that? Why do we resist this possibility? So I want to make it clear that the issue here, you can argue with the science. You can say, maybe you didn't have the right control condition. Maybe you should have run your experiments different. But it seems to me that people think that the notion of innate knowledge is an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense for knowledge to be innate. The question itself is nonsensical. And that I thought is really strange, because this is not how we think about the body, right? In the genetic era, we all know that the design of our body is innate, and we understand some of the genetic mechanisms of that. So why the possibility that knowledge can be innate? Why that seems to us as nonsense?
Do you want to sort of go on to outline your explanation for why we do make that mistake? Or
so my argument is that this belief in human nature, as you said, arises from human nature itself. And there are two suspects in crime. One is intuitive dualism. The other is intuitive essentialism. And these are each principles that guide intuitive reasoning. You can see them in young children. You can even see the roots of them in infancy. You can see them across cultures. So this is different than the philosophical traditions of essentialism or dualism, right? This is how we intuitively reason. And per dualism, and this is a lot coming from the work of Paul Bloom at Yale, people think that the mind is immaterial, distinct from the material body. So, for example, when we invite people to reason about a situation where, it would be possible to replicate one's body and to create a replica of oneself. And the question is, what traits of the original will transfer to the replica? The reasoning being that if those traits are in the body, they should transfer once you replicate the body. And indeed, physical traits of the body, such as a mark on one's forehead, people intuit, yes, that will transfer to the replica. But when you ask them about specific knowledge, like what's the name of your wife or what time your train comes home, that they think will not transfer to the replica. So this is immaterial, it's distinct from the body. Now, this is not just because, these ideas are abstract or people are confused about them, because if you ask them a different question, if you ask them what capacity transfer to the afterlife, right, when there is no body to rely on, there it's these epistemic traits, it's the cognitive capacities that indeed transfer to the afterlife. So the fact that we have what cognitive scientists call double dissociation between the target of the manipulation, whether you manipulate the body or the mind, and what transfers, tells you that people really believe that psychological traits are not part of the body. They are immaterial, just as Descartes suspected. But of course, we are talking about intuitions here. Now, if you look at dualism specifically, and you probe that further, you'll see that psychological traits are not all created alike in our minds. So if you think about vision or audition, you can kind of imagine how they are anchored in the body. You think that you see with your eyes, you think that you hear with your ears. But having a notion of number, right, or having a notion of an object, where in the body is that? This is entirely beyond the grasp of the body. This must be entirely ephemeral, entirely disembodied. So dualism leads us to the idea that not only psychology is generally immaterial, but in particular ideas, epistemic states, are the most immaterial at all. This is a problem because of how we reason about innateness. And reasoning about innateness is governed by another suspect, which is essentialism. And essentialism is the intuitive belief that biological kinds are what they are because they possess some innate, immutable essence. So when you ask a kid, what happens if you take a skunk and you painted it to look like a raccoon, they would say that this should still remain the skunk. The change to the exterior should not matter. Likewise, if you take a piggy, a baby, and raise it by cows, it will be like its biological parents that the piggy has never met, not like the cows. So people believe that these creatures have some essence that is inborn and determines who they are. The problem is that they don't just believe in an essence, but they further believe that innate essence must be material. It must be anchored in the body. For example, children will say that, the doggy is brown like its mother because it got some little piece of matter that it got from the mother. Or in some cultures, we think about the essence as in blood. That is possibly why in Jewish law you have to keep kosher, right? You have to remove the blood from the animal because that's the holder of the soul of the animal. So there is this belief that on the one hand, per dualism, ideas are totally ephemeral, distinct from the body. There is demand per essentialism that innate traits must be material, they must be in the body. So it follows that ideas which are disembodied cannot be innate. They don't check out the criteria for innateness that is given by essentialism. And basically what I'm saying, it's kind of a perfect storm. These two things are there. So dualism probably arises from, I should say, the roots of dualism are probably coming from core knowledge systems that are likely innate. So I don't think, I won't argue the dualism per se is innate in the sense that I don't think there's any reason to believe that there is any evolutionary advantage for one being dualist. The true source of dualism comes from the fact that we are born with different systems for reasoning about the physical world and about the psychological world. These systems are very much motivated. We do have evidence for them in very young infants. There is also an advantage for understanding our nature and and having that as a third system of core knowledge. So we are designed with these three different systems of core knowledge in mind. Dualism is really the confluence of the two systems of reasoning about the physical and psychological world. Essentialism is the third one about nature. And it's kind of a series of unfortunate events. They are just there to do very good things, but they happen to collide with each other when we bear them to think about human nature. And it's this collision, it's this perfect storm that is responsible for our innateness intuitions, among many other errors that we make about human nature.
Okay, fascinating. You covered a lot there. That was very, very elegantly done. So I see that was a very interesting point you made about dualism. It's not that we're born with some kind of tendency to a metaphysical doctrine.
Yeah.
It's more that we just have different systems for reasoning about objects and agents and people with intention. Is that right? Exactly. And so when we do that, we're thinking about them in different ways such that they have different properties.
Right.
So it kind of falls out of that. Is that
right? Exactly.
Very nice. Okay. And that combined with the essentialist idea that anything innate must be material.
Yeah.
You combine those two things and you get the conclusion that there can't be such a thing as an innate idea or innate knowledge.
Right.
Well, now that brings us to, I guess, the section of the book where you survey the evidence that there is a whole lot of stuff that is innate, right? And you move through a whole different series of examples. I thought let's talk about two things in particular. The first one I thought that might be a sort of neat thing to talk about is the 3 C's.
Yeah.
Cohesion, contact, and continuity. Tell us about those and in what sense we think, or why we think that infants have them innately, a sense of those innately.
And the idea is that when infants come into the world, they come with a specific notion of what an object is. Cohesion is the expectation that a moving object is a whole rather than a bunch of parts. It's such a basic intuition that it's kind of difficult to imagine the alternative. So how can object be not wholes? But to think about a specific example. So think about an infant who is spending her entire life in her crib, right? And she sees her mother only from behind the rail of the crib. So from her perspective, what she's seeing is she sees the head of the mother, she sees the legs of the mother. She never gets to see that the mother has a torso. So she sees this moving entity, legs are moving, head is moving, and they happen to move together. But this is just correlation, right? So is there actually a missing part, a torso that the infant kind of fills in, despite the fact that she has never seen it before? So to find out, one can run experiments and present infants, including newborn infants, with objects that are occluded so that the infant can only see the two parts of the object without seeing the middle. And then present them with two possibilities, right? You either present them with the full object that they've never actually seen, or the two parts, which are actually consistent with their sensory experience, and look at how infants respond to them. If the infant has imagined the full object, so upon seeing the two parts, that they should look at that as surprising. And that in turn should make them look longer at the surprising event. And that's exactly what's happening. By the same token, you can look at the notion of contact. So that objects, infants expect that objects only move by contact. So if you see a stationary ball and then you see another ball emerging towards it, you'd expect the stationary ball will start moving only if it's contacted by the moving ball and immediately after the collision. And furthermore, you expect the movement to continue along the same path as the original launching ball. These experiments have been done in newborns, and in fact, that's exactly what they expect. So this notion of contact, cohesion, and continuity are, with most likelihood, aspects of core knowledge. In fact, some of these experiments have been done in other animals and with the same results. And the continuity here, evolutionarily provides further evidence that with all likelihood, this knowledge is innate.
Now, this isn't a question that you are interested in dealing with in the book, but it's a question that I kept thinking about. And it's, how on earth do you get those things innately coded? Or how on earth do you build that into a baby that they expect the world to have certain properties? I think for me, it's just the idea that the tools of innateness, genes, and the way genes are expressed. So how do you build an expectation of cohesion, contact, and continuity in genes? They seem such different things.
How do you build hands in genes? I think this is equally puzzling. How is it, right? So you have the zygote, it has no hands there, and suddenly you have this embryo and you have this baby that has hands and has body, and all this emerges spontaneously. I think this is a totally mysterious thing. Why is it more mysterious for you to think that it's ideas? Of course, neither the ideas nor the hands are in the genes. These are phenotypic properties that emerge through the expression of genes in the body through a developmental process that involves environment, external and internal, and chance, and all the other things. So, embryology and development is very complex and very mysterious. The question is why it's the innateness of ideas that people intuitively think is more mysterious. So in your question, I think you are embodying the thesis of the book, in fact.
I think I perhaps am, but if I can try and defend myself a little bit, here's one explanation that I feel like is maybe behind my intuition here. And it's the idea that these principles of cohesion, contact, and continuity, they sound like computational assumptions about how to interpret sensory evidence for the world. That's how they sound to me.
Very much so.
And genes don't seem like the sorts of things that encode computational principles.
Of course, they do not. It's the brain that encodes them, and genes are expressed in the brain, and the brain somehow results in computation. But I think your mystery should be not the question of the gene, it's in the question of the brain, because we do not understand how the brain computes, period, whether it's innate or non-innate. If you look at some of the most basic properties of cognition, such as compositionality, right? The fact that you know that John and Bill came to the party, you know that Bill came to the party, and you know that John came to the party. It's not like this, there's this, holistic John and Bill thing. It's two entities. And this is not a choice. We just reason this way. Our brain compels us to arrive at this conclusion. I don't think that we know these days in neuroscience what brain mechanism compels us to arrive at this conclusion. You can say, this lights up and that lights up, but that is not a mechanism. That doesn't tell you what neural computation results in this obligatory cognitive computation. So our entire understanding of how the brain gives rise to thinking, innate or not innate, the innateness is the least of our concern here. We just don't have it. So I don't think the burden is on the notion of innate ideas in particular. The burden is we don't understand cognition in the brain. That's really the problem. So it is true that when it comes to cognition, you want to understand how genes give rise to the organism, to the brain, and how the brain computes. And it's this notion of computation in the brain that is mysterious to us still. But really, the problem is that we don't understand how the brain computes generally. And I think that's really the root of the problem. I don't think there is any reason to think that innate knowledge in particular is more mysterious. And, think about birdsong, right? Why is it not mysterious that birds have their song innately, which in fact they do? You can demonstrate that that's the case. Language is our song and object cognition is our song, so to speak. And these are capacities that we have that are part of, our biology. The fact that I strongly share your intuition, right? So I can definitely, like everybody else, connect to this notion of this is so crazy that ideas can be innate. Yes, it is crazy, but it's exactly us that make it crazy. I don't see anything in biology that should make it more crazy than any other traits of the organism, like walking, like flying, and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, your example of birdsong there is a great example, and it does seem crazy to me. How on earth is that innately coded? It is a really difficult thing for me to get my head around. I mean, I do accept that it is. It pretty obviously is. And actually, we've kind of veered into talking about language a little bit there, which is great because I really did want to talk about language now. We'll try not to spend too long on this because, as I said, the focus of the book is not on exactly what is innate and how it is innate. It's more on our intuitions and how they mislead us. But you do have a chapter on language, and there's a lovely quote in the book that is actually reminiscent of this idea that but birdsong is innately coded, and it's from Steven Pinker, with whom I know you've collaborated many times. And the quote is that people know how to talk in more or less the sense that spiders know how to spin webs. Web spinning was not invented by some unsung spider genius, and is not dependent on having had the right education. Rather, spiders spin spider webs because they have spider brains, which give them the urge to spin and the competence to succeed. So I thought that was a lovely notion, the idea that we know how to speak, to generate language in the same way that spiders know how to spin webs. Of course, the variation in the way that spiders spin webs is probably less than the kind of enormous variation in the different languages there are and ways in which we can communicate in language. But I guess to me, language is such a sophisticated, complex thing. It's the same question. It's the same intuition, is that how on earth do you build something that complex and detailed and apparently rule-bound in genes?
We don't know. We cannot I identify with your intuition. We don't know the answer to that. We can ask what genes can be linked to linguistic capacity and to linguistic disorders, but we don't understand how genes in particular give rise to specific principles of language. We just don't know that. This, however, is not to say that language cannot be innate. So the argument from an ignorance is not an argument for absence, right? It doesn't show that this cannot possibly be the case. And you can go to the lab and look at, you can examine the evidence. And I should say, to be fair, the case for language is complicated. It's complicated because, on the one hand, language is evidently learned, so there is the complexity there is to tease apart what is coming from learning and what is coming innately. The other complexity is from the complexity of knowledge of language itself. So to answer any question about the innateness of language, we need to understand what knowledge of language is like, which is a huge problem by itself. So the situation on language and the origins of language these days is not the same as the situation about object cognition in newborns. The field is very much divided. There is a huge debate on this question. I think there is evidence there to suggest that the capacity for language could plausibly be innate. I don't think that we know for sure. I think that there is much more that needs to be done, but I think there is evidence to think that this is not a nonsensical possibility, to say the least. And so the evidence comes, for example, if you take children from cases in which children were raised on a desert island, indeed, linguistic desert island, because they were deaf from birth, and they were raised by families who do not speak a sign language. When those kids come together as a group, as happened in Nicaragua, it turns out that a language emerged spontaneously, a sign language that those children developed. The sign language that is developed is demonstrably distinct from just using gestures as you and I would use in talking. You can demonstrate the differences, and you can show that the principles that guide the formation of this new language are similar to ones that are seen in other languages that the child has never encountered. And that suggests to us that the child really is, expressing knowledge for which they had no evidence. So this is what is known as a poverty of a stimulus type argument. The stimulus, the evidence for the child is extremely impoverished. The child is generating language. It doesn't happen all at once, right? It doesn't happen in one generation that you see a language fully formed. It doesn't happen to birds either, though. So in fact, there have been experiments looking at zebra finches and their song and how song emerges in the zebra finch. And this is a wonderful study by Olga Fair and colleagues that came out in Nature a few years back. And it shows how when you take, so very briefly, if you take birds and you raise them in isolation, it's the male that sings, but isolate males do not sing completely normally. They bear some elements, similarity to the original song, but it's a distorted song. It turns out that when you take these generations of birds and raise them recursively, such that you take one group, you raise them as they mature, you take one male, you make them the teacher of the next generation. So I should say the birds acquire their song by exposure to an adult male. So you take the first generation, you raise it in isolation. Then as they mature, you take one male, you promote it to be the tutor of a next generation of young birds and so forth. What was shown is that across generations, the song begins to emerge spontaneously and resemble the original song without ever hearing how original song sounds like. And I think this is a really good metaphor of what happens in language and the emergence of language. So I think what's difficult here is to distinguish the notion of, the birds need triggers. They need to hear the previous song, but this is not to say that they need to imitate the original song because they have no evidence that, they have no access to this original song to start with. So language requires triggers language develops, this is not necessarily the case to say that language only emerged by learning. So learning and triggers are not the same thing. And I think this is the difficult conceptual distinction here. Maybe I'll just say very briefly, in my day job as phonologist, what we've been doing is looking at principles that define universal grammar in phonology. And so, for example, we know that across languages, syllables like blog are super frequent. Syllables like lbog, L-B-O-G, are not frequent. It turns out that if you take newborn infants, they show the same preferences. And through very systematic investigation, you can show that this is probably an abstract rule that human beings have. It's not just about hearing that. It's not just about saying that. These are abstract principles that plausibly could be inborn. Although, to be fair, the jury is still out on that.
Sure. I think this is a good example where I think part of the difficulty I sometimes have with innate ideas is that the what we're talking about when we're talking about innateness is a bit crudely specified, and perhaps this is an example. So you're actually doing work going into to explore particular aspects of language, and you're looking at, the preference for certain kinds of sounds, certain kinds of syllables that might be universal. That's one very particular part of language, but it's very far from the whole thing, isn't it? So if we're making a very broad statement that aspects of language are innate, of course the real meat there is finding out, well, what aspects and how. Right. And there's an example of like a particular aspect of language, which is the phonology, which you work on, which and I really enjoyed learning about the stuff in your book, that there is this hierarchy of sounds, of certain kinds of syllables that are, from more common to much less common in languages across the world, and maybe there's some sort of innate basis there. But that's an example where you've started to break down this kind of general idea that language is innate, to go, well, maybe this aspect of phonology is somehow innate.
Right.
And so there we start to make progress, kind of understanding how it unfolds.
Yeah, the devil is in the details. And always in science, right? If you want to understand breast cancer, you'll have to look at very specific mechanisms. So it's always going to boil down to very specific proposals, and including formal proposals of what is the structure of the knowledge that you're hypothesizing. So this is difficult stuff.
It is difficult stuff. I want to throw at you a quote that I remember from university that I enjoyed, and I think you're going to disagree with it, but let's see what you make of it. Language is a new machine built out of old parts, emerging from a nexus of skills in attention, perception, imitation, and symbolic processing that transcend the boundaries of language proper. Now that's from Elizabeth Bates and Dick, a 2001 paper that I remember being quite struck by. So I think the idea is that it's language builds on other cognitive capacities rather than it's a kind of whole new skill on top of those things, quite sort of qualitatively distinct from those things. I think that's roughly the idea. What do you make of that?
Yeah, this is a tough argument. So really, nobody denies innateness. Everybody knows, everybody admits that something must be innate. If nothing else, it's the capacity to associate, stimulus and response that is innate. So the real debate in the field is not whether something is innate, but whether innateness has to do with specific domains of knowledge. So whether it's knowledge of language specifically that is innate, as opposed to, just audition, motor skills, social capacities. And the theory goes that, you have those distinct capacities inborn, you somehow mix them together, and somehow miraculously the capacity for language with this particular design emerges spontaneously. I can refute this argument. The problem is the argument is so unspecified that I don't know how it can be falsified, right? Can we rule out the possibility that this cake of language emerges this particular cake of language, right, that has this particular design and this particular structure, that emerges spontaneously by mixing all these other capacities? No. But then you better have a really good explanation of why is that time after time this thing emerges spontaneously. And to me, the more interesting question is, does the cake exist, right? Is there, in fact, knowledge of language with this particular design? I think the possibility that this particular design relies on an innate mechanism. So usually when you talk about innateness in biology, it's the specialized design that is usually the hallmark of an innate phenotype. Since we don't understand, since we really have no idea how these capacities emerge, I certainly cannot rule out the possibility that those things, you have these different things and mix them together, and that's how this capacity emerges. But I think the problem is that if you subscribe to this metaphor of emergence spontaneously, usually you don't just deny the existence of the innate capacity for language. You usually deny the cake. You usually deny that there is, in fact, a cake with a universal design that every language is going to, if you think about cookies rather than cakes, sorry for mixing metaphors. So you have these brown cookies and these red cookies and these yellow cookies, but they are all going to have some common shape. They're all cut by the same cookie cutter. It's this metaphor that I think is really denied, along with this notion that so it's not just universal rules of language that exist, but in fact, it's the notion that language relies on rules that is also denied by proponents, the proponents of, that you have just cited. And for this, we actually have specific evidence to the contrary. So I think we have very good evidence to assume that, yes, the mind knowledge of language relies on abstract algebraic rules, not necessarily infallible rules, but rules. Yes, there is such a thing. And second, there is reason to suspect that some of those rules could be present innately, although, again, this is controversial. So I think for me, these are the real fruitful questions to explore. How do you get into this design? I think this is, we are not there yet.
It's a very exciting topic. A tutor of mine, when I was studying this stuff at university many years ago, was Professor Kim Plunkett, who was into, he worked on connectionist networks. Yeah. That's one of these things. They're kind of these neural networks, and they're broadly inspired by the brain, by the way neurons connect with other neurons in networks. Yeah. And one of the key things about those is that it's not obvious in what sense they encode a rule. So you can train a network to perform what is effectively a computational task. So it might be encoding one of these, I was intrigued to use the word algebraic rules. Right. So some sort of grammatical rule about how to construct a sentence with an object and a subject, something like that. But of course, the way a connectionist network, and presumably a brain, but this is a really difficult question, the way a connectionist network works is there's a distributed pattern of activation across nodes with different weights, connection weights to each other. So they're either more likely to fire to this one or more likely to fire to this one, etc. And so there's no explicit encoding of a rule, but nevertheless, the behavior of the system overall seems to display rule-following behavior, if you like. So I remember that debate from many years ago. It sounds like it's still raging strongly.
Very much so, yes.
Would you say you're more on the side of the explicit rules are somehow buried in these systems? Yes,
totally. And in fact, I've some of my work explicitly looked at this question. So just to make it clear, we know computationally that you can use, so the type of algebra, so what is a rule, right? A rule is an algebraic operation that operates on variables, such as, just as you think of variables in algebra, so you can have y equals to x, where x is any integer. And the idea is that x is this class, it defines a class of elements, any integer, and it applies not to specific elements, to 2 and 3 or 4, but rather to the class as a whole. This is the hallmark of rules. In the same way that the plural rule says, take any noun and add an S to it. So noun refers to this class of elements that are all equivalent in principle, and you operate on the class, not on dog or cat, or the rule, in fact, is presumably entirely blind to these distinctions. So the debate is whether the mind, in fact, has these algebraic computations, has the capacity to operate on equivalence classes as opposed to specific elements such as dog and cat. We know computationally that you can take connectionist systems and they would implement a Turing machine. So a Turing machine is a universal machine or universal system. And you know that you can use a parallel system to implement those things. So it's not, so that's not the question of, there's no conflict between connectionism and rules in principle. The question is, in practice, whether the mind operates on rules or not. And here, the connectionist argument can be sometimes confusing because it can be read to say two different things. One is really a claim about innateness, where you start with a blank slate that had no capacity to represent algebraic rules, that there's no categories such as noun or an X. And somehow, miraculously, you do have rules in the system. Demonstrably, the system has these operations. And you can demonstrate it by, the proof is in the pudding, right? You can look at the pudding, taste it, look at what it has. Does it actually follow the hallmarks of a rule? I don't think that this is really what proponents of connectionism typically are saying. What they're saying typically is, no, it's not like a rule. There are really no rules there. It looks like a rule, it smells like a rule, but if you look at it very carefully, you see there ain't no rule there. It's really not a rule. It's a dog and a cat that if you look from far apart, it looks like, oh, maybe it looks like a rule, but it's not really a rule. The rule has, the variables have no causal role. They are not doing anything. And upon probing further, you can demonstrate that, in fact, it's an illusion. The mind doesn't have rules. It does not operate on a rule. And these are two separate claims, right? One is saying, yes, there are rules, but they emerge somehow miraculously, like the cake mixing metaphor. And the other denies that, in fact, the cake exists. Most people actually deny that the cake exists, deny that the rules are actually there. And I think this is demonstrably false.
Let's get back to the kind of central thesis of your book. Okay, so where are we? We've talked about and explored in perhaps more detail than we should have what things might be innate, and we've used vision, examples from vision, and we've used examples from language. There are many other examples that you explore in the book. What's the next component of your argument?
The next component is that the two suspects, dualism and essentialism, mess us up in many other areas. So the project is to explore those various cases in which the collision between dualism and essentialism interferes with our understanding of who we are. One case is the case of emotions. So it's precisely for the same reason that we believe that ideas cannot be innate, that people actually are certain that emotions as facial expressions are innate. They believe that newborns have the capacity to tell whether a face is angry or whether it's happy. This is actually false, but people believe that that's the case. It's not even clear that adults are as good as telling facial expression as that they believe we are. But when the hypothesis that we believe that what's in the body is innate. So to review, we said that our understanding of innateness is informed by essentialism. And essentialism demands that innate traits are in the body. So upon seeing a trait that we seem to recognize in the body, we think that happy is in our faces, that nervousness is in our stomach, and so forth. We jump to the conclusion, therefore, that this must be an innate capacity. And we ran those experiments, and that's exactly what we found, that people believe that emotion recognition is universal, that you will find them in hunter-gatherers who've never seen a human face and so forth. And furthermore, that innateness intuition depends on embodiment, namely, the more embodied the trait is perceived to be, the more likely it is to be perceived as innate. So, and the problem there is that it might mess up not only with intuitive psychology, but also with professional psychology. So, this intuition that we discussed before, how crazy is it that ideas are innate? This is an intuition that we share not only as intuitive readers, but also as practitioners in the field. If you look at the field of affective science, for which I should plead ignorance, right? I'm a completely, a novice. I'm reading it as somebody who is external to the field. But I'm struck with the fact that a lot of this discussion about whether emotions are innate is really a discussion about, can you recognize emotions in the face? Are the facial recognitions of emotions are innate? Right? So this research has started by asking what happens if you go to some remote society. Will a hunter-gatherer, in fact, will recognize emotion? And you wonder, why do people think the questions are related? Why, innate, why emotion recognition is necessarily evidence for innateness? Of course, if that were the case, that would be really handy for the researcher, but a priori, there is no reason to require that innate emotions must be facial expressions. In fact, you might think about them as computations, right? As, if you think about shame, right? How shameful, if you think about the worst thing that has ever happened to you, how shameful it is really depends on who else was watching, right? So, if, something, it actually happened to me. I once went on, a trip to Europe. I land in Zurich, and there it is, my suitcase with all my underwear in the entire, for everybody in the airport to see, right? And if it were my colleagues who were going to watch it, I think I would be less comfortable than, people that I don't know at all. So this is a computation. Shameful is a computation. It's not necessarily an expression in the face. And then you wonder why people construe the debate in this way. And you're wondering whether essentialism messes up not only with our intuitive thinking, but also in our science. But of course, I leave it to others to make this determination.
It's mind-blowing to me that that something as apparently sophisticated as language is underpinned by a lot of innate knowledge, but something as apparently sort of basic as emotion doesn't work in quite the same way, or have I misunderstood what you're saying there?
I actually saying that language and emotion may very well work in the same way. They are both computations. The difference is in how intuitively we perceive that. So for us, language is cold cognition, emotion is hot in the body. But this is something that we impose thanks to the two suspects, right? Thanks to essentialism and to some extent dualism. It's, when you think about it logically, there is no reason to draw this boundary the way we do.
I see. Okay. So this is, it's a key example of how dualism and essentialism lead us to misunderstand our own nature. In this case, emotions. Right.
And indeed, the boundary between thoughts and feelings might in fact be the result of this, of dualism and essentialism as well.
Okay, so we've surveyed some of the first sort of component of the book is a sense of the evidence for innateness in different domains. And we've talked about vision, we talked about the 3 C's, and we've talked about language. Then we've moved on to talk about the ways in which dualism and essentialism, these biases towards dualism and essentialism, can lead us to misunderstand or misunderstand is the right to distort our understanding of emotion, and to think that emotion is somehow innate and universal in some simple way, when maybe it's a much more complex scenario. And then the final part of the book, you explore, I guess, much broader repercussions. And there are two we can focus on. One is that we are very seduced by the allure of neuroscience. We go insane about the brain, as you say. And then the other one is how it influences the way we think about mental disorders. So let's start with this neuroscience. How do these two influences of dualism and essentialism, how do they sort of conspire to make us prize neuroscience-y sounding explanations over non-neuroscience-y sounding explanations, even when neuroscience isn't necessarily adding explanatory value in any particular case?
Right. So there is a line of research by Dina Weisberg and colleagues that show that when present people with a phenomenon and give it an explanation. So, the curse of knowledge, people believe that if they know something, somebody else knows something. So the cognitive explanation is that people confuse their own knowledge with the knowledge of others. But if you further tell them there is area X, frontal cortex, whatever, that fires, they all of a sudden believe this is a much better explanation. And in fact, they think that the brain is a better explanation, even when the explanation itself is totally circular. They still think, putting the brain makes it a better explanation. And it's not just the science. So maybe to give you the general sense, people read the New York Times, which is a very good newspaper, has these headlines like musician brains are different to non-musicians, or when you learn how to read, your brain actually changes. I mean, why is it a headline? What do you expect? What else? I mean, if it was something else, that should be a headline. But that learning to read changes your brain, or the dyslexia changes your brain. I mean, you wonder, why people think this is newsworthy. And indeed, you see the same bias when people reason. Again, they think that if neuroscience is injected into the explanation, that the explanation is better. And the explanation that I suggest in the book to this seductive allure of neuroscience is that it really, neuroscience is preferred because it resolves a dissonance. So the dissonance is actually the same dissonance that Descartes himself recognized, which is if you're a dualist and you believe that the mind is the cause of behavior, then you have a problem, right? How is that mind and matter cannot interact, right? So how is that this ephemeral, immaterial stuff can actually affect change in matter? And if you're a dualist and you're getting a cognitive explanation such as you're confusing your own knowledge with the knowledge of other, and you think that this is ephemeral stuff, then you're completely lost. How is that? Could that possibly make somebody behave? Press a button, or how is my thought of coffee will make my hand move to the coffee, right? How is it possible for mind to command matter? And neuroscience miraculously solved the whole thing, because it's telling you it's not your mind that is not doing anything. It's your brain that is doing the whole thing. It's body that commands body. It's matter that commands matter. And the whole mystery is solved. Well, if that's really the case, then you can actually test this hypothesis, which we did in the lab. This is the master's work of my student, Gwen Sandovi, that actually followed the following rationale. So if you believe that really the source of this insane fascination with the brain is this dualist dissonance, that you think that mind cannot affect matter, then the allure of neuroscience should be the strongest, where the dissonance should be the strongest. And the dissonance should be the strongest for ideas, right? If you think about epistemic capacity, this is the most ephemeral thing. This is the least likely to be capable of affecting behavior. So you would predict strongest dissonance there. And indeed, that's exactly what we found. So, so if you gave people with, say, explanation of autism and told them, if you inform them about, an epistemic symptom of autism, which is in fact people with autism have troubles with theory of mind, there they thought that neuroscience is an excellent explanation, right? But if you told them people with autism have sensory problems, there the neuroscience was not that, necessarily as great as an explanation. What's paradoxical there is that when we ask them, okay, now tell us, how likely is it that you'll find theory of mind in the brain? Or how likely is it that you'll find auditory hypersensitivity in the brain? They thought that, theory of mind, the epistemic capacity, is less likely to be in the brain. So what they're doing is the trait that they think is less likely to be in the brain, that is the one that they think for which neuroscience is going to be the best explanation of all. And that makes no sense whatsoever, right? It is not, it can't be a rational preference. And it can't be that they just know something, that they've heard from that they know so much neuroscience that they think one is more plausible than the other. So our theory is that it's dualism, it's the dualist dissonance that makes us fall insane with the brain.
Okay, very good. Let's move on to mental disorders. Now, how do these dualism and essentialism, how do they lead us astray when we think about and perceive and respond to people who have mental disorders?
Right. So my interest in this area really started by, I was really puzzled when people talk about mental disorder and they're asking, is it physical or is it psychological? And I never understood what they were really talking about. And like there are two different categories there. And, what's going on is that people have really, strong biases against people with mental disorders. This is something that has been known, for ages. And in an attempt to combat these attitudes, these biases, at the late 90s, the US Surgeon General decided, okay, let's educate people. Let's tell them that mental disorders are diseases like all others. They are brain disorders. They're the same as cancer. They're the same as, any other disease. You would expect that learning that should remove the bias, right? We don't have a bias towards a woman with breast cancer. Why should we have a bias towards a woman with schizophrenia or depression? It didn't work, right? It didn't work. Furthermore, it backfired. There is evidence then that when you tell people that the disorder is in the body, even if you tell them it's just in the brain, this actually increases negative attitudes towards patients. People think that the disorder is less likely to respond to treatment, that it's actually more severe, and so forth. And this is really puzzling. The two suspects that we have invoked actually can explain what's going on, right? Because per essentialism, traits that are embodied are likely to be innate. So upon telling people the depression is actually in your brain, you are satisfying essentialism. You're checking out essentialism, our criterion for innateness. And in so doing, you're basically telling people the disease is more likely to be innate. And per essentialism, it's not just about innateness, it's also about traits that are immutable. So if your depression satisfies essentialism, it's also less likely to change. It's going to less likely to respond to treatment. So in this way, essentialism promotes this negative attitudes toward psychiatric disorders. Per dualism also, if you know that the trait is in the brain, you believe it's innate, but if you believe it's in behavior where you don't have explicit evidence for the body, you think that it's kind of just in your mind kind of thing, and therefore you would be less likely to make the same presumption. So you're less likely to jump to this conclusion of immutability and so forth. So primarily essentialism and to some extent dualism can explain why we jump to these conclusions for mental disorders. It turned out that when you look at, so in this way, the attitudes toward, say, depression, which we consider as a disorder that inflicts emotional suffering, mimics our attitudes towards emotions, about typical emotions, which we perceive as innate and so forth. If this is true, if this, divide that we form between hot emotions and cold cognition is true, then when you look at cognitive disorders, you would expect that people should be less likely to perceive them as innate, in line with their attitudes towards thoughts. And that is indeed also true. So if you look at something like dyslexia, right, which is a cognitive disorder, and in fact, technically it's a psychiatric disorder, it is in the DSM, right? But when you look at what people think about there, these days people are more, you still find people who think that dyslexia is just in your head, that, it doesn't exist, that it's not a real thing, which you would totally expect if you think about cognition as ephemeral. You also, for the rest of the population, you see that lay people have really strange attitudes about dyslexia, that they think that many of them think that it's just letter reversal, which is actually not correct. And I think these attitudes reflect how, again, if you think that a disorder, if you believe the science that dyslexia is a disorder like all others and that it is inborn as we know it to be, then you are looking for some sensory explanation, because sensory explanations like vision are likely to be in the body. And therefore you would think that if the problem is you can't see it well, you can see the letters, then it is more likely to be innate. And the research that we, have conducted in the lab did suggest that your perception of the severity of dyslexia depends in systematic way on whether you think it's a sensory disorder or the cognitive disorder that in fact it is.
Okay, so we're coming to the end now. So I guess my last question is, we've seen how these twin forces or these twin notions of dualism and essentialism are innate in us, or we haven't really explored why in much detail why they're innate, but we have suggested they're these kind of persistent features in all of us that we're constantly drawn to. They're constantly whispering in our ears, as I said in the introduction, which is a lovely phrase that you use in the book, systematically misleading us and leading us astray. But you seem to have figured it out. You seem to have seen what's going on and recognized it. So what hope is there for the rest of us? What is how have you sort of got yourself out of this distorted perception, and how do the rest of us manage it?
I think enlightenment comes from science, right? From understanding. So again, we are an orchestra. We are not just this solo sax that whispers dualism and essentialism in our ears. We have reasoning capacities. These are the other instruments in the orchestra that helps us inspect those things, and hopefully in so doing recognize that what dualism and essentialism whisper is a false tune, and hopefully by recognizing, it's kind of okay, it's there, it's okay, we know that it exists, now let's look at the evidence. I think that kind of attitude might help. And also by investigating that and educating people about their misconceptions, that hopefully will prompt this process of self-examination and, getting out of blindness. So getting out of the cave, so to speak.
Well, on the note of the enlightening promise of science bringing us all to an accurate understanding of reality and of each other and of ourselves, I will say a deep thank you to you, Professor Iris Berent, for sharing your ideas.
Thank you so much, Ilan.